Black slavery. In essence, this topic is really about the question of whether or not Black people enslaved other Black people, whether Black people are responsible for the enslavement of Black people, whether Africans sold Black people to Europeans in the transatlantic slave trade. These are questions, I think, that are critical, and that there is a lot of disinformation that is out there on these topics. And what I'd like to do is bring some clarity and understanding to this, because very often I hear the excuse to justify slavery by saying, well, Black people, Africans sold Black people to Europeans, or, Black people put Black people in slavery. And so you hear these things and you're hearing them, it's becoming more and more popular, quick to try to justify the enslavement of Black people and to downplay the impact of the European slave trade, and particularly to reject the notion or ideal that some reparations are owed. So let's go into it and let's take a look at it and examine it. First of all, if we go back historically and look at the slave trade in Africa, not only in Africa, but many other parts of the world, slavery of what today, when we look back and we think in terms of the word slavery, systems that existed in the past that involved what you might call slavery or servitude is actually very different from a system of chattel slavery. And let me make the distinction. Slavery itself may involve you basically being involved in something that you don't really want to do. So, for example, let's say that you were arrested for a crime and you were brought before court and you were charged and you were found guilty, and the court sentenced you to do labor or to work or to engage in some activity or be under someone else's supervision. In modern terms, we might look at that in terms of seeing it as slavery, as a form of slavery. But you retain your human dignity. You are not the property of someone else, and you retain your status as a human being. So this is the system of African slavery that existed. So persons who were captured as prisoners of war, they may be required to work for the tribe that captured them, and they may be required to be under the supervision of the tribe that captured them. But they retain their human dignity, and in addition to that, they may even rise up in the tribe and become part of the tribe and marry the tribal leader's daughter or marry the daughters of other leaders within the tribal community. And and so this was very common, and people that were taken as supposed slaves, they became part of the new clan, the new group, and they became prominent members of that group, and they took on their identity and citizenship and became part of that group and played a prominent and important role in those groups. And this was very, very common, and it was more or less the general rule of how things operated. There also were people who were debtors. They weren't able to manage their own personal situation, and they became debtors. They owed money or resources they couldn't pay, and they were brought before the tribal council or whatever, and they were then subjected to punishment for their debt because they couldn't pay their debt. So they may have been required to provide service to the people that they owed. And so they would become in service to someone that they owed, or go into service to someone else who would then pay the debt for them. And so there was debt slavery. But debt slavery did not remove their human dignity. It didn't classify them as less than a human being. They retained their identity, their language, their communication, and in addition to that, they were not deemed property or chattels. And so, in terms of looking at this, we can see there was like debt slavery, there were prisoners of war, there was punishment for crimes. And so these are the main three categories that a person would become considered a slave. A person may also become a slave by indenturing themselves to someone to say, hey, look, I'll work for you for a certain amount of time in exchange for. And it was more of a contract. And so when we look at this whole system, this is the essence of African slavery. And this, in essence, is a type of slavery that really was very much worldwide at one point in history. And so this is what we see when we look at the African continent prior to the entry of Arabs and then Europeans. We see that this type of slavery existed. So when we think of slavery, when we think of Africans enslaving other Africans, this is the type of system that existed. And in addition to that, it is, I think, very important to recognize that it did not involve the racial component, where slavery was race-based and you became a slave because of your race and you didn't have human dignity because of your race. That was never a part of any African slave system. And so in terms of looking at and understanding, I think that's the very foundation that we have to look at and examine as part of understanding this issue about blacks enslaving other blacks. So this is prior to contact with people who brought the ideal of chattel slavery. Now let's distinguish that and understand what chattel slavery actually is. Chattel slavery is the ideal that one person becomes the property of another person. In other words, you lose your human dignity, you lose your status as a human being, you basically take on the same status as maybe a chicken, a horse, a cow, or farm animal. You become the personal private property of an individual who's the slave master or a group. And what happens is you lose your human dignity, you lose your status as a human being, and you become reduced to chattel or property. And this system developed as a result of first around 652 CE, the first system of chattel slavery was imposed in Africa with the conquest or attempted conquest of Nubia by Arabs, who brought this system of chattel slavery into Africa after they conquered Egypt. They then turned their sights to sub-Saharan Black Africa in Nubia, to Mokoria and Nobatia and Aloha, in this region where blacks dwelled below Byzantine Egypt. And this system was developed that was based upon a racial doctrine that was established that actually racialized the concept of the curse of Canaan. And so they used the Bible to say that blacks were black because of the curse of Canaan. And because of this ideal that blacks were black because of the curse of Canaan, it placed black people in the position where black people, in the eyes of the people that were capturing them, they lost their status as a human being, and they were denied human dignity, and they were relegated to the status of chattels, of being owned as property, and they lost their status as a human being. This was the first system of racially based chattel slavery. And this was imposed as part of the conquest of, or attempted conquest initially, of the Sudan regions, the Nubia south of Egypt. And this was first documented in about 652 CE. And the whole doctrine that surrounded it was based upon this interpretation of the Bible section of Genesis that talks about the curse of Canaan, but it was racialized in a set of writings called the Israelite, which there's a whole history in terms of looking at the Israelite. It's also important to distinguish between the Israelite. There was a group of Arabic version rabbinical writings distinguishable from the Talmud, distinguishable from the Babylonian Talmud, and also distinguishable from the Jerusalem Talmud. And so this set of writings that were promoted through a man by the name of Kabal Abar was introduced into the Islamic Caliphate that adopted this and made this, and it became part of Islamic law very early on. And so this system of racially based slavery actually lasted all the way up until the end of World War I. And it started in about 652. And this became part of the Islamic empires. And you can go through and see the various different empires that developed, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Rushdans, the Ottomans, and even some of the intervening smaller attempts at caliphates, which were really sultanates, like the Fatimids and the Mamelukes. And so we see this system in place. It becomes part of Islamic culture. It becomes part of Islamic history, and then eventually it's used to support the trans-Sahara slave trade and the East Africa Indian Ocean slave trade. And the trans-Sahara slave trade took about 11 million sub-Saharan black Africans into slavery and sold them throughout Southern Europe and the so-called Middle East and the Baltics, and and it was a racially based system of chattel slavery where a person lost their human dignity. Many of the males were castrated. And so in terms of, when we look at it, it's a distinctive history that we can examine and look at and see the impact of chattel slavery, of when a person is owned and they lose their human dignity. And it's all based upon racial mythology. In addition, we see in East Africa about 9 million Black East Africans were taken into slavery, chattel slavery, and they were dispersed throughout the so-called Middle East and South Asia, and as far as Indonesia. And so you had this dispersion or disbursement of people that were brought through this slave trafficking system that was part of the Arab Islamic Empire. And then ultimately also the Turks and the Persians and others who actually at different times controlled the Islamic Empire. They also participated and promoted this. It was part of the culture of the Islamic world. And so you had about 20 million black sub-Saharan Africans who were subjected to this kind of slavery, this race-based chattel slavery. And so it's important to be able to recognize and understand this system of slavery and its source and origin. Later, the Europeans come in the 15th century. And when the Europeans enter, they also impose and engage in race-based chattel slavery. And they, in essence, actually take over the system that had been operated by from the Arab Islamic world. And they take that system over. They take over trade routes. The Portuguese come in and they decimate the trade routes and take control of the traffic to India. They take control of all of the major trade routes, the so-called spice trades, and also the African slave trade. And so when we began to take a look at this, they then adopt, of course, the curse of Canaan, and they also began later to adopt other versions of support and ideology to support the race-based chattel slavery system. So they developed doctrines of Aryan supremacy, the Teutonic origins theory. They had the Piltdown scholars. They had phrenology. They had a host of different pseudosciences that they developed in order to justify race-based chattel slavery. And so in terms of looking at this, I think it's important to be able to understand the nature and distinction between slavery that existed in Africa among Africans and then slavery then that was imposed upon Africans from outsiders who came. And some of those outsiders were Arabs. They also were Berbers who had been subjugated by the Arabs. And they became operators, basically, of the Arabs. And plus, they were a distinctive group of people that had been separated by the Sahara Desert, and there was a distinction between sub-Saharan black Africans and the Berbers from North Africa, the so-called Amazigh people. They actually had mixed in with the Phoenicians. They had mixed in with the Assyrians, with the Persians, with the Babylonians. They had mixed in with the Greeks. They had mixed in with the Vandals. They mixed in with the Romans, and they mixed in with the Arabs and Turks. And so there were waves of groups of people who actually invaded North Africa and who controlled it at various different points in history. And it's important to understand and distinguish that history that existed prior to Islam coming, and to understand the nature of who the North African population was, because they were distinguishable from sub-Saharan black Africa. And the North Africans spoke an Afro-Asiatic Semitic type language, whereas sub-Saharan black Africans spoke Bantu languages. They spoke they spoke languages that were Niger-Congo, in the Niger-Congo family of languages, in Nilotic languages that were all connected as part of what's called Bantu languages. And so in terms of being able to understand and recognize the linguistic differences between the two groups, also the physical differences because of the period of time in which they were separated for thousands of years. And there was some communication across the desert, but it was very limited in terms of its impact on the development of the existing populations from either side. And they were involved in trade, but Islam brought an increase in trade, and it also brought a demand, because as the Islamic Empire's footprint grew in terms of the territories that they controlled, there was a greater and greater demand for labor. And so this resulted in, for example, in about 869, the largest slave rebellion in human history is documented and recorded to have occurred in Basra, Iraq. And about 500,000 black people from East Africa. And this is why it's called the Zanj Rebellion, because the Zanj people, Zanj is another name for East Africans. And this so-called Zanj Rebellion were enslaved Zanj people, East Africans, black Africans, that had been taken to the southern part of Iraq. And they, in fact, were enslaved, and they staged the largest slave rebellion in human history, with about 500,000 black East Africans rebelled in the southern part of Iraq, which was not far from Baghdad, which was at that time the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, which was the Abbasid empire, the Islamic empire. So it's important to be able to get those things, that kind of background in, and to be able to to recognize this. Now, what I want to do is I want to look at some more recent stuff. I want to look at 1441. Prince Henry was appointed to be head of an organization called the Royal Order of Christ, and he was appointed by Pope Martin, I believe the second or the fourth, and this appointment to the head to the Royal Order of Christ actually was like a corporate entity. It was like a corporation where the equivalent of millions of dollars was invested in this by the church, but through the papacy, through the Pope. And Prince Henry actually used the money to invest in the mass production of ships that were called caravels. And these caravels they were ships that they could get right up to the shore. They could get close up to the shore, close enough to drop the side of the ship down. And up to 400 armed horsemen could ride out the side of the ship and ride up onto the land. And this was a technological innovation that took place in the 15th century that was mass produced. There was a financial investment from the church. And this involved Prince Henry of Portugal. And in addition to this ship technology that was invested in, they also invested in something called the arquebus, which was a short barrel rifle with a firing mechanism called the matchlock. So they mass-produced these short barrel rifles with the firing mechanism called the matchlock. And these were technological innovations that gave the Portuguese a superior advantage for a period of time. And they used this to then begin the plunder of the African coast. And as they began plundering the African coast, they built forts along the coast. And many people don't really realize, but ultimately they built at least about 79 slave ports. Now, there were probably over 150 altogether, but there were about 79 that survived and they had any permanency, because in some cases these ports, they didn't last. They put them together and they ended up, being defeated, or there were reasons they didn't last. But what happened is they came along and they built forts. And these forts that they built, like they built about 40 forts along the coast of what is now modern day Ghana. And people hear about Elmina Castle and Christianborg Castle, and they hear about Cape Castle. They hear about Gorée Island off the coast of Senegal. They hear about Bimbia in Nigeria. They hear about Luanda in Angola. They hear about Bimbia in Cameroon. There's about 79 ports that they are well documented historically. And these ports were set up where they had cannon facing the ocean in order to protect themselves from rival Europeans who would try to come and take over, because other European countries would try to take over the port from them. And they also had weapons pointed to the interior of the land, because there were tribal groups and Africans whose land was being occupied and who resisted. And so these were hostile forts that were set up. They were done as military garrisons, and they were set up, and ultimately they were used to promote trade. They also used them as a base of operations for operations that they made into the interior. And when we actually go and look at some of these ports and how these ports actually developed, what we come to understand is that, like, for example, you have ports like, for example, Elmina Castle was first constructed in about 1482, Elmina Castle. The port of Ouidah was constructed about in the 1580s. You had other ports like Badagry was constructed in 1425. You had ports in Luanda and Bangula that were established. Luanda was established in about 1575 and Bangula in about 1617. So when you began to look at these ports, and then you can see the documented history about the conflicts, because what would happen is the Portuguese ports would maybe get attacked by the British. They might get attacked by the French. They might get attacked by the Dutch. And the Dutch would take over the port. Sometimes they sold the ports back and forth to each other and traded the ports. So these have a very interesting history. But what is consistent about them is that when they first established these ports and they first began trafficking in Africans to enslave Africans, typically when they came in, they obtained Africans by force. They sent expeditions into the bush and they captured people. They captured villages. They captured whole groups of people. They brought them to the fort. The forts generally were set up to have dungeons and have holding places where they would hold people in ships, and then they would board them on the ships and send them through the Middle Passage. And most of them had some portal that people had to pass through to get to the ship that became known as the door of no return. And so this became very, very significant to understand, because what we see is people make the claim, they say, well, Africans sold other Africans into slavery. Well, let me try to illustrate a point by talking about, for example, in the Congo. In the Congo, in 1526, the Afonso, the king of Congo, his relationship with the Portuguese started out as a trade relationship and trading various commodities, not people, okay? And so eventually by about 1526, people were being taken. And what happened is Afonso protested to the king of Portugal. And this was well documented. And it's an important historical record to help us to understand what was going on during that time. And he wrote to the king of Portugal. Afonso said in 1526, he says, each day the traders are kidnapping our people, children of this country, sons of our nobles and vassals, even people of our own family. This corruption and depravity are so widespread that our land is entirely depopulated. And so, he goes on and he says that it is our wish that this kingdom not be a place for the trade or transport of slaves. This was the sentiment of an African king in Congo. This sentiment is similarly expressed all up and down the coastline. You find these types of communications. You find the record of these types of events. And then, of course, like, for example, in Bimbia, the Portuguese came in. They took the local king's family hostage, and they took them out to their ship. And they made a demand for 1,000 people, enslaved people, in exchange for this royal family. And so it put the king in a position to have to either sacrifice his family or go find 1,000 people from another tribe that he could bring in exchange as a ransom for his family. And he went and got people and exchanged them as a ransom for his family. And this became the Africans' participation in the slave trade. This is Africans trading people. Now, this is a group of people who do not practice chattel slavery. So when they turn people over to the Europeans, they don't know that the Europeans' system of chattel slavery is a life system. They don't know what the fate and the outcome is going to be. They actually did it to protect their family that was immediately taken and held hostage. So we have similar situations like this happen all up and down the coast. And, and so it's important to realize that when we look at how slavery unfolded along the west coast of Africa, the European version of slavery, because Arabs and Berbers primarily used what they call the scimitar, the slashing sword, a curved sword. And they also very often had Arabian horses. But in terms of looking at the system along the west coast of Africa as it developed, for example, the kingdom of Dahomey. Many people will look and say, well, the black people sold other blacks into slavery, and they talk about the kingdom of Dahomey. Well, the kingdom of Dahomey was involved in the selling of Africans as slaves for almost 130 years. But if you look at the history, Europeans entered there and they established the slave fort or slave port at Ouida in 1580s. Okay, so they were like 100 years or more that they were there actually taking people into slavery and raiding to take people into slavery. And then they built an alliance with a local group of people that they started trading and giving firearms to. And so once this local group of blacks got firearms and were trading with the Europeans, then they became involved in the slave trade, and they became the agents of the Europeans to go and capture people in the interior and bring them into slavery. And they did this in exchange. They gave them benefits. They traded different things, including firearms, in exchange for them going in and capturing rival tribal groups and other groups of people. And they brought them to the shore in order for them to be sold into slavery. In addition to that, if you look at even the Ashanti Empire, we see Elmina Castle established in 1482. But we don't see the rise of the Ashanti Empire and it becoming involved in the slave trade until about 1670. So that's like what? 170 years. So in other words, you have Europeans on their own engaging in the slave trade and capturing people using violence and devastating black communities for almost 170 years before they then get a group of Africans, a small group, that they help come to power. And so the Ashanti Empire actually comes to power because Europeans give them guns and weapons and build alliances with them in order to capture other black people. And this becomes the source of the Ashanti Empire, that part of the Ashanti Empire that became involved in the slave trade. In addition to that, if you look at the Kingdom of Congo, we see, I read earlier what Afonso said from the Kingdom of Congo in 1526. And we see that after Afonso complained about slavery, later he was overthrown. And the Portuguese put a puppet leader in place so that they then became involved in the slave trade. And the slave trade was driven by Portuguese. And Portuguese supplied firearms, they supplied troops, military advisors, and the whole bit. And they then attacked and plundered the interior. If we look at the Oyo Empire, we see that Badagry was established in 1425. And so you have a slave port, because remember, they're taking people to Europe as slaves before they even discovered a new world, so-called New World. So in Oyo, we have Badagry's established on the coast, but Oyo doesn't become, until a couple hundred years later, become involved in the slave trade directly themselves. And they become directly involved in the slave trade as a result of being given firearms, building an alliance over time, And basically, in essence, usually they were provided protection by the Portuguese against other rival groups and then provided firearms. And then they were compelled into an alliance. And we can also look at the Arrow Confederacy in the southern part of Nigeria, where this took place. And it isn't until the late 1600s and early 1700s that they become involved in the slave trade. And so when we began to see this, we see Luanda and we see Bangula. All of these ports existed long before any of the people in the region got involved in trading in slaves. And so it's important to understand and distinguish this fact. But here, I think, is the most significant thing that we have to really genuinely understand to really understand this issue, is that all of these groups that existed eventually became in conflict with the European groups at some point, and their empires were defeated. Okay, but in addition to the empires being defeated and destroyed, if we take a look at the Berlin Conference in 1884, the Berlin Conference. At the Berlin Conference, Africa was divided by Europeans into colonial territories. And the colonial territories became the modern boundaries of the existing African states. And these lines were drawn without regard for traditional tribal boundaries. So Oyo, for example, may be included in Benin, Nigeria, and Cameroon. You have other groups that spanned multiple different territories. And then because of the war and conflict, you had major migrations of groups who migrated to other regions because of war. And so and they're being defeated by Europeans who had firearms. So when you begin to actually look at this drawing of these new lines, for example, if you take, like various different groups, like let's look at Senegal, for example. So in Senegal, in 1960, Senegal became an independent country known as Senegal today. So people that may have been involved in the slave trade that were Africans, this would have occurred many years prior to Senegal being founded as a country. And Senegal is composed of a population that consists of the tribal groups, the Wolof, the Pular or Fula, the Sara people, the Mandinka people, the Jola people, the Sanaki people, the Basari people, the Badiski people, the Luba people, and several other groups. And so of all of these groups, you may have had one group that was involved with Europeans in the slave trade and who helped Europeans and sold their brothers and sisters into slavery. But Senegal today is composed of a massive number of groups of people, and you may have one small ethnic group that had any involvement whatsoever in the slave trade in the past. So today, if you go to Senegal and you were to say, well, the Senegal sold our people into slavery, that would be factually incorrect. And based on what I'm telling you now, and if you investigate it and verify what I'm telling you, what you'll be doing after that, you'll be willfully lying if you promote the lie to say, well, Africans sold other Africans into slavery. And so this, these people in Senegal, that they shouldn't get any reparations because reparations belong to us. That ideology, that thought, it's all based upon misinformation. You take a look at Ghana, for example. In Ghana, there's a group of people that were called the Akan people. the Akan people actually is made up of multiple tribes under the Akan people. One of those tribes was the Ashanti. The Ashanti were involved in selling black people into slavery. But today, Ghana became independent in 1957 after being a colony of the British for many, many years with artificial boundaries. Okay. So you had a small group of people that way in the past sold some black folk into slavery, but now you have a country called Ghana. And Ghana includes the Bono people. It includes the Gobi, the Maasai, the Wee, the Ga, the Guan, the Adangbi, the Akan, a host of other groups of people who had nothing absolutely to do with selling black people into slavery to the Europeans, to chattel slavery. And so you have one small group, a small population of people, descendants of those people who had some culpability. And they did so basically out of coercion, if you understand what actually happened. And so today, to say that Ghana should not get any reparations because they sold black people into slavery, it is not only factually incorrect, it is an affront to intelligent people, right? So we can look at this and see in Guinea became independent in 1958. Okay, so this is a new country. Before, there was no country. There were tribal groups and tribal territories. Now you got a country. And this country has people that are the Fula, the Mandinka, the Susa, the Capelli, the Kissi, the Luma, and a number of other groups that exist within the boundaries, this new territorial boundaries of the what was a colony, the colony of Guinea, that became a country. Just you look at Nigeria. Nigeria became a country in 1960. And they had the Hausa Fulani, they had the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Ijo, the Kanui, they had the Trivi, they had the Edo, they had a number of other tribal ethnic groups in Nigeria, the vast majority having nothing absolutely to do with selling black people into slavery. And today, black people in America, we are the descendants of some of these families of people that they're part of our family because we were taken from them and brought into slavery. Their families were devastated. Not only that, they themselves, their lands were taken. They were tortured. They were forced into labor. They underwent all kinds of atrocities on the African continent. Millions were unalived there in the process of taking us into slavery, our ancestors into slavery. If you go back and you look at Cameroon, you have the Bemilinki, you have the Banum, you have the Dula, you have the Fulani, you have the Baka, you got a host of groups that are there, has absolutely nothing to do with the slave trade in terms of their participation. They were victims themselves. The vast majority of the population that remained, they were forced to labor. They were forced under various different adverse conditions and subjected to the African Holocaust. If you go to Angola, Angola received its independence in 1975. And so you've got a host of groups in Angola. Okay, same thing, Ivory Coast. You actually go to every country and you find the same thing. So when you say that black people sold other black people into slavery, and you take the position that these African countries sold us into slavery, these African countries did not even exist during that period of time. And those African countries today that exist, they're comprised of groups of people, the vast majority of which had absolutely nothing to do with selling black people to Europeans into slavery. And even those that did not willfully do so in the sense that their concept of slavery was very different than the European concept of chattel slavery. And certainly they knew that Europeans were brutal and that Europeans were, like immoral. They understood those things, I'm sure, because of their interactions with them. But their concept of slavery was very different than the European concept of slavery. And only smaller groups, very small groups, out of any of these places were involved at all in slave trade. So to come in and say that Ghana sold our people into slavery, or to say that Guinea sold our people into slavery, or to say that Nigeria sold our people into slavery. No, all of these groups of people were victims of the African Holocaust because millions of people were unalived. Like take, for example, in the Congo, 10 to 15 million black people were exterminated under King Leopold in the so-called Congo Free State. 10 to 15 million people. And if you actually study, what you'll find is most of them underwent conditions that were worse than black people experienced in slavery in America. And what's happening is because we don't understand the history, because we are not really investigating what's going on. We're listening to the algorithm. We're listening to somebody else telling us some crap to try to turn us against each other so that we are not working together, so that we are in opposition to each other, that it's all designed to divide us, to keep us from being successful. It's the way to keep us in a mental condition of slavery. And we have a lot of black people now participating in promoting and maintaining this system of mental slavery, because they are now, you got people accusing, say, for example, Ghana, saying, well, the Ghana president, they're trying to take our bag, and they're trying to upstage us and take our reparations. They're not even asking for reparations from the United States per se. They are talking about the return of their artifacts, perhaps billions of dollars worth of artifacts taken from them that are now in museums across Europe. In addition to that, their resources have been exploited. Their populations were devastated. You have a whole unfair racial-based system that actually depressed their communities from developing. And you look at, this, and they were they were a British colony. So when you talk about reparations, you have to really understand the distinction. And what's happening is black people in America aren't the only people that were enslaved. Black people in America aren't the only one that was subjected to Jim Crow segregation. Black people in America are not the only ones who underwent some race-based atrocities against them. There were millions of black people, not only, in terms of when we look at this, you got 12 million people and only 380,000 were brought directly from Africa to North America. Another 70,000 brought from Africa to the Caribbean, and then from the Caribbean to North America. So you look at, there's 110 million Afro-Brazilians who underwent similar circumstance. There's like 12 million Afro-Colombians who underwent circumstance. You begin to look at all of the situation, and you begin to understand what really happened and what is actually going on now. Ghana didn't just one day pick up and say, okay, I'm going to sponsor this piece of legislation in the United Nations and get it passed. No, this was an effort by 54 independent African nations and 13 independent Black Caribbean nations. So this is not something that just he thought it up the other day. He's not representing himself. He's bringing forth something that's on behalf of 54 Black nations, 13 independent Caribbean nations, and also representatives from the Black community in the United States, Colombia, Brazil, and Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and all over South America and Southeast Asia, Black communities. He's bringing something from a worldwide global perspective. And he's bringing this as a declaration from a global community through the United Nations. And what's happening is some of us, because we can't really see or understand the bigger picture, because we don't really, understand exactly what's going on, that what we do is we have some people that are jumping to the conclusion saying, oh, he's trying to take our script. He's trying to take our bag. He's trying to, he's doing these things against us, and that we are entitled and nobody else is entitled. And in reality, that view is it's actually pathetic. It really is pathetic, because it's like groping in the darkness. We have no clue of what's going on. And in many cases, we have folks that, they want to argue and argue and argue, and they don't ever want to listen or hear anything, because they don't really understand what's going on. And they're speaking just a bunch of ignorance. And what's happening is the rest of us have to endure it. We have patience. Many of us, we have the patience, and, we hear you and all of that. And then we try to reason with you, and we try to help you to see the bigger picture and help you to understand. But very often, you're more interested in proving that you know something that you don't know than you are in actually learning the truth. And so what we're here to do is talk about the truth and focus on, let's learn the truth, because it is in the interest of us all that we all learn and understand and know the truth. And so this is very critical, I think, because what happens is we create a divide amongst ourselves and we weaken our position, because even if, for example, you look at the civil rights movement and Black people getting voting rights and having basic fundamental rights in this country that we often take for granted now. We would not have those rights had it not been and it was interesting to me that Malcolm X made an observation. Malcolm X was talking about, he said, well, that, they wouldn't give us any of these rights if it wasn't for Africans who have independent nations. Now, these African nations have become independent. And because these African nations are independent, the United States depends on them for buying the cocoa, for the chocolate industry. It depends on them for coffee, depends on them for various commodities, depends on them for bauxite, for tungsten, for plutonium, for uranium, for a host of different products come from these African countries. And the United States needs these things. And with Africans in charge, Africans say, well, look, the price goes way up. And it changed the whole market system where the United States is at a disadvantage. So how does it look for the United States to still be allowing Black people to be lynched in the street, to still have Jim Crow segregation, to still deny Black people voting rights? How does it look for them when they go and try to negotiate business deals with new African countries, and they're got their foot on the neck of Black people in America? It doesn't look so good, and it doesn't do well in terms of negotiating deals with these Black people, all of whom the leaders came out of the Pan-African movement. All of them are part of a network of people. Many were educated at Lincoln University and Howard University and Hampton Institute and historically Black colleges and universities in the United States. When we began to look at and understand this, and the fact of the matter is that these African countries had a major impact on the United States, such that the United States needed to impress them by saying, hey, look, we respect the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We no longer practice Jim Crow segregation. Black people have the right to vote in the United States. We enforce civil rights so that black people can go anywhere they want and be part of the society. They had to do that in order to impress those African leaders. So when you say you did it on your own, you are fooling yourself. You're telling another lie and demonstrating you don't really know what happened. You don't understand the history. So Malcolm X told us about this. And then also Dr. King, he said also in the human rights revolution, if something isn't done and done in a hurry to bring the colored peoples of the world out of their long years of poverty, the world is doomed, And he talked about, he says that, he talked about no matter where black people are assembled today, the cry is always the same. We want to be free. And he talks about, he says, whether they are assembled in Johannesburg, South Africa, Nairobi, Kenya, Accra, Ghana, Atlanta, Georgia, Jackson, Mississippi, or Memphis, Tennessee, the cry is always the same. We want to be free. And so these were black leaders during that particular time telling us our dependency and support and relationship with black people worldwide. They understood this. It's the modern individuals now saying, to go get a trademark and say, well, we're FBA. And they want you to become part of their trademark. So they want to, in essence, it's like saying, I'm going to own you and you're going to be FBA. So I own you because I own the trademark for FBA. And that is the mentality that is existing. This telling you misinformation, this misleading you. And it's got you attacking people that are trying to build the overall global black community, people like the president of Ghana, who actually is not doing this on his behalf or on behalf of Ghana itself. He's representing 54 independent black countries on the African continent. And he's also representing the 13 Black Caribbean countries because he's representing a voting bloc within the United Nations. Because trust me, before they brought this to a vote, he already had the votes lined up because he's been working on this for several years before it was brought to the floor on March 25th, 2026. And so in terms of understanding this is so critical for us to really gain this understanding, Now I'm going to shift to another thing. Okay, if we look into chattel slavery in Virginia, there's a whole story about that. People talk about 1619. There's a ship called the White Lion. And of course, the White Lion and the Traveler, there were two European ships, or the Treasurer. They actually got into a conflict out at sea with a Portuguese ship called the Bantista. And they took 60 people who were enslaved on the ship, their cargo. They took these from this Portuguese ship. The Portuguese, they were selling to Mexico to sell them. They were taken, 30 went to the White Lion, 30 went to the Treasurer. The White Lion arrives in Virginia. They sold their cargo to the colony government because they needed laborers. So they bought enslaved Africans. So these were the first Africans that were enslaved. Now, even though there was no law in place for slavery, a positive law for slavery to say, okay, you are a slave, slavery was the custom that was brought. And these people that were brought, they were bought as chattel in 1619. A few days later, the treasurer arrived, and because of the connection of the treasurer to other groups of people, they refused to buy the cargo of the treasurer. And they only sold a couple of people that were brought from Angola. They sold them to private individuals. And the treasure went on, and they sold their cargo in Barbados. Well documented. They go to Barbados and they sell the remainder, like 28 people. They sell in Barbados. Okay, so this is these are British people selling black people as slaves. They actually interdicted or stole a cargo from the Portuguese. Okay, even though they later are heavily involved in trafficking directly to the African continent. You go through and you look at and you understand this system that exists in Virginia. And then, of course, there's a legal process it goes through. Then Virginia actually adopts laws that say, okay, well, if you're black here, you're a slave for life automatically. Even if you came here as an indentured servant or you came under some other status, whatever status you came under, if you're black, you're going to be a slave for life. So once they passed this into law and made this part of the law of the land, people like Anthony Johnson, who had been an indentured servant and who actually owned people, he had to flee. He had to leave. He went to Maryland. Why? Because they were going to make him a slave in Virginia. And so all of that aside, and all of that's interesting history, and I usually will go into that, as part of a detailed presentation. I also usually, as a typical presentation on this, if this is my main topic, I also distinguish the British system of chattel slavery, because the British focused on the chattel slavery of Africans. Prior to that, the Spanish had a system called the encomiendo system, and it actually did not enslave the people directly. It actually took control of the land and then forced the people on the land to labor. And then they transformed into a new system called the repatriement system, and it actually was a reform of the old system that created labor camps where groups of Native Americans would actually have to send groups of Native Americans to labor for the Europeans in order to maintain peace. And they developed really a system, a ransom type of system. So some of their systems were very different than outright chattel slavery that broke both the Portuguese and the Spanish. The British, on the other hand, had direct chattel slavery because they never really dealt with the enslavement on any large scale of Native Americans. So Native Americans had almost been wiped out by the time the British colonies began to be formed in the 1600s. And so in terms of looking at and understanding what happened, we can see those systems that the Portuguese used and that the Spanish used. And we can also look at the Dutch and others. But what becomes most interesting, I think, is recognizing and understanding that when we begin to take a look at black people in North America particularly, what I want to do is I want to distinguish something. I want to point out something I think that's extremely important to understand as part of this system, and that is that there were about 3,775 free black individuals who owned 12,760 individuals as slaves. They owned black slaves. So this is often referred to as black on black slavery, that blacks own other blacks as slavery, and it's used as a justification. But when we closely examine this, okay, you see there were 220,000 YT slave owners and only like less than 4,000 free blacks that were slave owners. About 75% of black slave owners were actually individuals who had purchased their own family from slavery. They obtained their freedom, and they then purchased their family members' freedom. And so they owned their families on paper. When you go back to the documentation, this is about 75% of those people, in terms of 75% of this 3,775 people, about 75% of this 12,760 enslaved black people, that about all of those were family members that were being brought out of slavery, that were being brought out of slavery by these people who gained their freedom. And so to look at it and say that, black people enslaved other black people in America, and that blacks held slaves and all that, about 1.2% of free blacks owned slaves. And 75% of the slaves that they owned were their family members that they purchased to get out of slavery. I was going through, in terms of studying, doing my own family research and family genealogy. And I had a great grandfather in Maryland, Eastern Shore in Kent County, Maryland, in Chestertown. And I found the records. Now, I have the family story about the family and, their children and their grandchildren and and this is one of my great grandmother's grandparents. So I have all the family story and all of that. But what I found is, when you count the number of people that were considered black slave owners in Maryland, my great grandfather was considered a slave owner. And my great grandmother was considered a slave owned by a free black. So my great grandfather acquired his freedom, and then he bought his wife out of slavery and manumitted her so that she was free too. And then they raised a family, and I am part of that family. But when you go back and look at the record, he is counted as a slave owner, and she is counted as a black slave owned by a black slave owner. And so this is true for about 75% of those people that have been able to document that this is the case, with 75% of the people here now that are under those numbers. So when we look at it, there's probably a much higher percentage, because the paperwork wasn't always straight. But when you take a look at what we've been able to verify, about 75%, this is the case, very similar to the situation that my grandparents went through. And so, when you start talking about, black people put other black people into slavery, and, all of these things that you want to present, this negative propaganda, what it is, and I call it negative propaganda, because what it is, it's propaganda to justify slavery and to exploit and promote a false belief regarding the extent of black culpability and involvement in slavery. Why? Why do you do this? When you take a look at it, it's why? Because of an evil intent. It can only be based on an evil intent. The evil intent to justify European history, to justify white supremacy, to attempt to escape any responsibility for the actions of your ancestors. And so certainly there were some black people that may have been involved, but when we began to look at it and understand it, it's like, I want you to think of, and I don't know how many of you guys saw the movie Django, and the character Stephen on Django. Samuel L. Jackson played the role of this character, Django. And Samuel L. Jackson in an interview said that his role as Stephen in the movie of Django was to illustrate the character of the most despicable Negro in the history of the world. That's what he was trying to achieve in displaying this character in this character of Django. He was he was the white T man's Negro, and he was more anti-black than the white T man was. He was the Clarence Thomas of the times. And so in terms of looking at and understanding the history and understanding what happened, it's critical to recognize and to see the reality of what took place in history. And so I say this for the purpose of hopefully helping someone lift the veil from their eyes so that they can see clearly, so that they can understand what actually happened and abandon these attacks on your own people. And so with that, I thank you for taking the time to listen. And I hope this has been enlightening and of value, and that has helped somebody to improve understanding of the history. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. Be blessed.